And I think that as built environment professionals, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we are doing everything we can to support planetary health, because if we aren't, we won't have a sustainable city to live in that will sustain us as humans. So what does the problem look like? And I'm really highlighting factors which I think are of importance for healthy cities. First of all, many urban environments exclude people and exclude lots of different kinds of people. So these figures here with percentages of the population who are, for example, disabled or female, are global figures. So every city will have a different proportion. Some will have a higher number of older people or a higher number of children. And we don't, as individuals, experience just one characteristic, but a series of characteristics. And from an intersectionality perspective, we can think about how those would be layered in terms of the impact that it might have on how welcome we feel within an urban environment, or how convenient or safe it is for us to use that environment for things that would support our health, like physical activity or social interaction. So historically, we've seen that urban environments have been designed by people. Historically, it's starting to change, but predominantly built environment fields have been male dominated, and they may not have as good of an understanding of the needs of some people within society who don't match their own needs. And so this is one of the challenges that I think is really important to consider for healthy cities. It plays out in terms of specific design measures that seek to exclude people within society, such as hostile architecture, where we use the physical material to deter people from lingering or sleeping on shared spaces, but also through designing out play, through features such as this bench, which are designed to stop skateboarders, or rules and regulations in public spaces which say no ball games or no play. A second problem that we have in cities for health is inequitable access to healthy environments. And we have study after study from around the world that shows the people who are living in neighborhoods which have a higher population of racial and ethnic minority groups, but also lower income populations, have a higher burden of unhealthy environments, and they have reduced access to healthy environments like parks and quality housing. And so this trend of inequities can be found time and again in studies from around the world for lots of different exposures. One example from the UK, specifically in England, found that people living in the most deprived neighborhoods were 10 times less likely to live near green space than people in wealthier areas. And then a third part of the problem relates to ecosystem and planetary health risks. So these are risks that are contributed to by the way we use resources and the way we run cities, but the impacts of these risks are also felt within cities through mechanisms of environmental degradation, such as climate change. So we know that air pollution is responsible for somewhere between 7 and 9 million deaths annually around the world. Climate change, we don't have really great estimates of how many people's deaths can be attributed to climate change. It's underestimated at the moment, but it's at least 150,000 deaths a year. And things like unsafe water and other sanitation and waste and hygiene deaths and illnesses, which are not only a problem in low and middle income countries, which is something that many planners might think, oh, that doesn't really apply to me, but it has been a problem in higher income countries, and particularly in relation to communities which are predominantly racial and ethnic minority groups and lower income groups. And one of the examples of the way that this plays out is through urban heat island intensity. So we have different layers of exposures going on and impacts from climate change. So where we are living in communities which may be of greater exposure to absorbing heat throughout the day and not having shading from green infrastructure, The study here from 2021 looked at neighborhoods across US cities, and they found that the summer daytime urban heat island intensity was worse for both people of color and the poor compared to white and wealthier populations in nearly all major US cities. Many planning academics and researchers working alongside health researchers have connected historical practices of redlining from the 1940s, which separated neighborhoods within cities on the basis of their desirability for real estate investment, but also had ongoing impacts on how urban infrastructure is placed within a city, so less desirable uses being in those redlined neighborhoods, which are now causing these heat challenges. So I've outlined the problem, I've brought in considerations of inclusion, equity, and sustainability, and now I'm going to talk about what we might need to do to redefine what we mean by healthy urbanism. So to do this, I've been using the Thrives framework, and this stands for Toward Healthy Urbanism, inclusive, equitable, sustainable. And the diagram may look familiar to you if you're familiar with other diagrams about healthy urban environments. So the Dahlgren and Whitehead social determinants of health rainbow looks a little bit like this, if you were to cut it in half here and put people at the center. Another iteration on from that, the Barton and Grant the health map or healthy settlements map looks quite a lot like this with concentric circles, again with people at the center. I have intentionally inverted the diagram to not put people at the center, but to center planetary health and the three core principles of sustainability, equity, and inclusion. This is not the same as the Dahlgren and Whitehead social determinants of health model, because I'm not talking about all the things in our lives that affect health. I'm just talking about the design and planning of urban environments. So what we can influence as professionals working in that space and public health professionals who also want to support healthy urban design and planning. And I think that as built environment professionals, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we are doing everything we can to support planetary health, because if we aren't, we won't have a sustainable city to live in that will sustain us as humans. So that is at the center, along with these intersecting core principles. At the top, you can see there are three scales of health impact, so planetary, ecosystem, and local. And they align to the design and planning goals, which are visible here. Each of these comes with a strong evidence base demonstrating that something like biodiversity is directly linked to health outcomes in a variety of ways. And then they align across to the scales of decision making. So supporting planetary health through enhancing biodiversity and promoting resource efficiency and zero carbon design and planning is most efficiently done at the city region or city scale. Again, this is focused on urban environments, so of course national policies and state policies or provincial will be really important, but we're focusing here on urban professionals. And so these scales are interconnected, and if you think about buildings, of course we can look at zero carbon buildings, and that's another really important area. Somewhere around 16 to 20% of our global carbon emissions are coming from buildings. So this is really important, but there are interconnections here. And this diagram is meant to be a heuristic for us to help us think through what are the relationships between different aspects of design and planning and health outcomes. So there's a few different ways that we can put this conceptual framework into practice. And the first way is about thinking beyond the boundaries. So the Thrives framework wants us to understand that the health impacts of a new development often occur far away from that development. So by bringing in additional scales of health impact, we're thinking further afield in terms of spatial scales as well as temporal scales. Many times with health impact assessment, we think quite short term and also spatially near to where the development's happening. And so we miss out on being able to say, well, this development will be really bad for carbon emissions and therefore it has a health impact. So we need to think beyond the boundaries of development. spatial and temporal boundaries. One example of that would be the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, which has done really excellent work in terms of biodiversity action planning and implementation. The QR code that you see there is to a link on the healthyurbanism.net website. We did a project where we looked internationally for healthy urban development case studies, and we tried to do it in a systematic way. Many of these case studies are not published in academic journals, but they're in professional publications and PDFs and websites. So it's not a systematic review, but we were looking for developments that met a number of different criteria and screened them in several ways. So the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park isn't perfect, and we are very clear in the overview case study that we produced some of the challenges in relation to groups being displaced who had lived on that site before the redevelopment and the Olympic Games there. That being said, a huge amount of affordable housing has been produced on this site, and people were offered the ability to come back onto the site within the affordable housing. But from a biodiversity perspective and the impacts that this development has on the wider community in the region for London and even further afield, I think is very significant, and it's useful for us to consider as an example of how one development can benefit a wider city. People from across the city can travel and use this beautiful green space. It will have benefits in what is a very heavily developed industrial part of London. It will have benefits in terms of cooling and other aspects. A second area to implement the principles of healthy urbanism would be to target actions and to use inclusive processes. So we need to recognize that there are structural barriers that prevent healthy living for many people. A lot of the public health literature has focused on promoting healthy lifestyles and healthy choices. And through the healthy urbanism work that I've been doing, I have suggested that from a built environment perspective, we are aware that people often don't have a choice about how they will get to work, depending on where they live within a city. Driving may be the only option. And similarly, if there's no access to healthy food, it may be really difficult for people to have a healthy diet. So not centering as much the language of lifestyle and choices and focusing more on the structural barriers, which can also be systemic structural challenges that we have within our culture, such as racism. Like I mentioned with the redlining example, that would be a structural barrier that's influencing access to healthy urban environments. So an action that we can do to overcome this challenge is to target interventions or actions within a city to improve those historic problems that have been created through bad urban design and planning, and to design with inclusive processes. And that targeting aspect, I think, gives the impression of saying it's a top-down, that we would do some kind of mapping of the city and identify where the problems are and funnel the resources in. And there's a little bit of a need to do that kind of understanding of where are the problems. But rather than deciding what the solution would be, that is very much a co-production exercise of saying, what kinds of problems do people feel need to be prioritized, and what solutions would they like to see? So this case study from Copenhagen called Folkets Park, I just highlight in relation to the community engagement process, which I think, depending on where you are in the world, there's a big spectrum in terms of what would be done for community engagement and how well that would work. So the Folkets Park example, I think, is particularly interesting because it was a space that was being heavily used by immigrants and people experiencing homelessness within the city. And moving from London to Seattle, I can see what a very large topic this is on the west coast of the US. I don't know how central the topic it is here in Vancouver, but it was not as central in London. The challenge that we had with homelessness in London was managed very differently. But it was very notable that the planners countered some of the strong voices within the community who said, those are illegitimate park users, and we don't want their voices and their involvement in the redesign of this park. and the planners within the city said they are users of this public space. It is a public space, and we are going to consider their needs to create a park that will be safe and welcoming for everybody within the city. And I think that, again, you can look on the case study to see more detail about what that entailed. But I do think that's an important part of engagement, where we recognize that oftentimes the voices who are speaking the loudest don't represent the needs of the most vulnerable people in terms of health. And now a final aspect on how we can translate the framework into implementation using sustainable design. So when I started writing the Thrives framework, environmental degradation and the health impacts that it was having around the world wasn't as front of mind as it has become over the last 3 or 4 years. It's really increased in our media coverage of extreme weather events and other disasters that have had huge health effects. So environmental degradation affects health now, not in the future. We often talked about climate change impact as being in the future, and I think we are starting to change our thinking on that. But sustainable design is, there's a set of principles and a set of standards that can be applied to support health. And that's something that I don't think has been done very well within public health literature. So there are many construction standards and frameworks that we can apply from the scale of individual components and materials up to building design, streets, and large-scale infrastructure projects. And I think that those are part of our public health toolkit within cities that we can promote more widely. So this example is from Australia. Nightingale Housing is a model for housing. Is anybody familiar with this model? I know there is a researcher in Vancouver who's done some research in this area. The Nightingale Housing model is trying to fill a gap for what would probably be called the missing middle in Melbourne, and then it's being applied more widely now in Australia. So rather than providing probably detached, smaller sized homes, they've provided apartment living that people can buy at an affordable price. They do a lot of work within the design, streamlining of the design, and also of the infrastructure and utilities that are put into place so that it's affordable up front and that it remains affordable in the operation and use of those units. And they've also applied a kind of covenant, or I'm not exactly sure what the legal terminology would be, but people who buy into that property know that they can't make a huge profit at the point of sale. So the profit is going to be limited in line with some area level price rises. Not to say they won't make any profit at all. But that's an area that they are looking at as an organization about how to do that, because it is difficult to look at how to use those measures completely independently. It's not at all driven by the local government involvement in this project. There is no local government involvement. Why is this good for health and sustainability? They've built this development to really high sustainability standard in terms of not using any fossil fuels to heat or cool or use the electrical appliances within the homes. And they've also considered many social sustainability and social interaction components. And so there are shared spaces on the roof for laundry. Actually, that was one of the ways they dealt with affordability, by not having individual washer and dryer units within each unit, but having a shared laundry space on the roof deck. They have shared gardening, and they do a lot of programming that would support social interaction, like you can see this dinner here. So I've been through the Thrives framework, and then how that can be applied in practice through a number of case studies. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the barriers and enablers that I think continue to be a challenge for us when we are trying to put forward policies or make decisions on specific developments in relation to health. So one of the chapters in the book, as I came towards the end of the Healthy Urbanism book, I was thinking about all of the barriers that I had set out, and framing became a solution or an enabler that I felt could be really positive to counter a number of the challenges that we face. So the language that we use when we talk about health and the social determinants of health can be a little bit off-putting for people who aren't from the health sector. And so this organization called the Frameworks Institute, which is, I believe, based in Washington, D.C., but they do operate in different places. They were also in London. They help to explain complex policy issues using terms that a wide variety of sectors will understand, and they test different kinds of language and different approaches with these groups. One of the ways that they've recommended to talking about health is by using a community health foundations metaphor. So talking about the foundations of a building and how that would be things like services and a school and access to employment and other things that we would need in our lives as a foundation for health, upon which you could then layer more healthcare and health systems aspects. So thinking about the language we use, I think, is really important because one of the barriers is certainly that it's not part of our training in the built environment, and it can be off-putting to think, oh, this sounds very technical and that I need some kind of medical training to work in this space. But actually, it's really bread and butter for what many urban design and planning students are learning about. It just isn't, the connection isn't always made. Positive language is another one on the framing. So an area where I think we've suffered as academics, but also probably within people working in different advocacy groups or within local government, we tend to focus quite a lot on the challenges that are facing us and outline all of the really worrying effects that we see of climate change and biodiversity loss. And sometimes less attention is then paid to the solutions that we might put forward. Sometimes we don't put forward any solutions at all. So we're just outlining the problem. And this is very problematic if we're trying to convince people to take action. So the Frameworks Institute has suggested that we start using more positive language. It's not to say that you don't address the problem. So you would state the problem clearly and succinctly, and then you would move on to, and here's how we steer around the problem. And I think that language will work really well with people who are making decisions in the built environment, like developers, who are not coming at things like healthy urban design and planning from the perspective of necessarily a long-term view of supporting the objectives of a city, but they have oftentimes a shorter-term economic focus. Trusted messengers is another area. I think it kind of makes sense to consider you're trying to communicate to different sectors, and therefore you want to work with somebody who already understands that sector and may be able to adopt and help you kind of champion the causes of healthy cities there. But addressing economics, I think, is a really fundamental area, and oftentimes one that public health professionals working in the space of healthy cities don't necessarily understand and have a lot of training about economic viability and development viability. So I want to spend a moment talking about that. And this is a diagram that I've adapted from Yvonne Ryden's work, and I've explained it from the perspective of health. So this is from a chapter in the book about building the business case for healthy urban development. And what I'd just like to briefly explain here is that when we're looking at a development going forward in a city, let's assume that this diagram is in relation to a large-scale mixed-use development with housing and maybe retail and office space. The developer will have to pay the cost for the land, the cost for developing the land, and potentially costs associated with planning policies which say you need to feed into some kind of pot of money to pay for schools or roads or affordable housing. And those factors will squeeze their profit, but it depends, again, on how much money they can make from selling the units or leasing the units. And so the numbers that feed into each of these aspects, it's not always clear to planners. Sometimes there's a black box that the developers are working with. But if we have an understanding of, there's different leverage points for us within this. So local authorities might look to make land available at a really low cost if they can find a developer who will do really high standard energy efficient design and other aspects which would support a healthy development going forward. And so it is possible to make a business case for healthy urban development. It doesn't always have to be more expensive than other kinds of development. It depends on which stage within the design process we start to bring in higher quality design aspects. And we can also see that there's a growing amount of evidence about the economic benefits of healthy development at different scales. So studies have looked at rental premiums for healthy buildings, where around COVID, there was also simultaneously within the real estate industry an increase or a kind of resurgence of interest in healthy buildings. And a lot of that, I think, has been driven by the US standard for healthy buildings, the WELL standard. There's a number of others, but this has put a particular focus on office spaces, which tend to be leased rather than sold. And that's what this figure is talking about. Some of the gains within there get tied up into productivity and whether employers think that there'll be a productivity benefit. I think that's a little bit problematic because I don't like to think of people as, machines, and we're trying to squeeze the most out of them, and therefore there's somehow a benefit that should entice us to make healthier places. A similar argument can be made about higher property values for living in walkable areas. So this is kind of an old study, but I think there'll be numerous others that can show us a similar effect, that looking at walkability scores and comparing property values, that we see a higher property value for higher walkability. But the problem is that this would stop lower income communities from getting that value if we didn't somehow intervene. And then looking at really much larger infrastructure projects where evaluations have been done to show that there are economic benefits related to the health benefits of large-scale infrastructure, like reduced road crashes from the bus rapid transit system in Bogota, or even the congestion charging zone in London. They've evaluated that from lots of perspectives, but I think just noting that there is a net revenue, a really significant net revenue that can be reinvested into other health-promoting infrastructure for active cycling in London. So just to underscore, there is a possibility of making a positive business case, but there are also challenges when we just focus on the numbers, and we need to think about who's being left out and what are some of the knock-on effects. So I'd like to introduce now what I think are some promising models that don't get caught up into that immediate perspective of we need to make a return on investment very short term, because it's important to remember that the organizations that are paying for a healthy urban development aren't necessarily the same organizations that are benefiting from the health economic benefits that have been created through that design. And so those benefits are distributed really widely across society, depending on whether you have, for example, a universal healthcare system that the National Health Service in the UK would benefit a lot by developers and local authorities making healthy spaces, but the same model wouldn't work in other places. So community-led development, I think, is a really exciting and positive way that we can start to create healthy cities. And this is an example from Cambridge, Marmalade Lane, where a group of people came together and worked really closely with the local authority to build around 30 units. It's a mixture of homes, and then they over time added some more apartments on the site. And they share a lot of amenities on site in terms of shared cars, shared garden spaces, and other amenities. It's building on the Baugruppen model in Germany and other European cities that have been doing shared housing and shared development for a very long time. And in Germany, it's much more tied into local authority planning. So the local authority will look at the city and select sites which would be suitable for shared housing development and go through a process where groups of future homeowners on that site can come together and bid for a particular site and have a designer on board. So local authorities can support this type of work coming forward. Another area which I think is interesting to consider comes out of some research that we did a few years ago, where we talked to developers and architects and designers in 6 different countries, and we asked them about some of the challenges and the barriers that they face bringing forward healthy development. And we found that they were commonly describing different types of developers. So on the one hand, we found kind of categorized outcome-driven developers who have a longer-term outlook, very interested in the ongoing functioning of that space that they develop, they may retain that asset rather than selling it on, and that's part of their interests. Or they may be driven by investment in focus on societal impacts rather than return on investment, which is something that's starting to shift. They still pay attention to finances. But they may also be very interested in innovative practices, going beyond regulations, and piloting or experimenting. Whereas output-driven developers, I think we see as commonly volume house builders in the UK fall into this category where they do have a focus on shorter-term goals. They are selling on the properties after they're built. Therefore, they don't maintain that long-term interest in the maintenance and the viability over time of the site. So where local authorities can work with and incentivize outcome-driven developers, or where as a society we can start to indicate that we have an interest in those types of developments that they produce, I think that's a positive sign that there is a room for change. This example is called Grow Community. It's in Bainbridge, Washington. And I went on site and interviewed one of the people involved in bringing forward the development. And I learned that the investors were really fundamental in this particular project at driving the sustainability and the focus on social connection within the site. So you can see that the houses are actually facing each other on this shared footpath with the intention that people would have kind of impromptu encounters as they come in and out of their house. There is a target towards some of the older people who tend to retire in Bainbridge, and so wanting to have more social interaction as we age, really important. And there's a number of other features there, but really interesting that it was driven by those investors. And then another area that I think is a promising possibility for us is on pilot and demonstration projects. So these can be used either through support from a city or completely independently to try out new designs and also demonstrate that they are viable in terms of the technology that could be used or the economic viability. The Bullitt Center in Seattle trialed a number of new building-related technologies and showed how those were viable over time. And it actually ended up resulting in some changes within the city to develop a livable building demonstration project that was an incentive for developers to use a particular standard. And another example on pilot and demonstration for healthy cities would be during COVID, a number of cities did kind of slow streets or low traffic neighborhoods and use those trials to then make those efforts more permanent after COVID. So I would like to turn now to talking a little bit about what I still think is a very interesting kind of ongoing challenge for us. And this is just a few slides to wrap up my talk and hopefully to have some discussion with you about this afterward. So this is what I think is of interest to me about the idea that the decision-making that we do within cities is driven by narratives that we have about how we should live and how cities should be formed. So if you go back to that you choose exercise that we did at the beginning and think about what were the underlying values that you had that made you want to live in a particular type of urban environment, and do you think other people share those, and if not, why? Where would the conflict and the tension arise? We see narrative underpinning policy at all different scales of government. So I've put in a couple of examples here, which are at the local government scale in New York and in San Francisco, where there was local opposition to affordable housing, which oftentimes comes up in local government. And then on a national scale here, headlines from the news in London, where the PM, Rishi Sunak, has vowed to stop the harebrained schemes that are stopping motorists from doing what they want to do. So I think that there are some strong narratives and cultural values that are underpinning these actions. I'd like to focus on a little bit more on the Sunak example, because I think there's a few interesting layers going on there. It's really directly related to healthy cities in a number of ways. So he's looking at stopping 20-mile-per-hour zones, which are shown to be to save lives and be good for children and older people as well, and reviewing low-traffic neighborhoods, as well as 15-minute cities, which have become really contentious over the last less than a year. So thinking of narratives, I'm going to ask you to think again about, in your minds to reflect, and maybe somebody wants to shout out what narrative I might be referring to here that I think influences urban design and planning and is directly at the heart of debates about how we design for healthy cities. Any thoughts on the kind of meta-narrative cultural idea here? It's USA focused.
Family life.
Yeah, definitely. Family life. Yeah.
White picket fence.
Definitely white picket fence.
I'm reminded of Betty Friedan's The Problem with No Name.
Okay.
Moving to the suburbs and the white picket fence house.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the back?
It feels like individual choice because you're separate from, like, you have your own fence, you make your choice of what happens inside your yard, and that's your domain.
Self-sufficiency. Absolutely.
Privacy.
Yeah. Yeah, you would get privacy.
It reminds me of the sort of like the myth of the American dream.
Yeah. American dream is what I had in mind, but also then kind of ties into all of those other aspects that we're talking about. What does the American dream mean? That anyone can own a home and have their own domain and have independence and have security and self-sufficiency. But what does that mean for healthy cities? It becomes really problematic in terms of how we use land, it's very difficult for everybody to have this when you start to get increases in population and you want people to be able to move around the city in a way that doesn't pollute the city and doesn't lead to sedentary lifestyles. So that's definitely, I think, something that from a healthy cities perspective is underexplored. Here's another one. We're all familiar with these kind of advertisements. I had one word in mind that I think is directly related to this Rishi Sunak debate right now, harebrained policies stopping motorists. What have we been told about cars for our whole lives? Cars give us freedom. Yeah, we all know that. And if an urban planning academic comes forward and says, I think we should have 20-mile-per-hour zones and 15-minute cities, well, some groups might suggest that that's curtailing freedom. And I think that debate really is at the heart of many discussions in cities around the world where we try and bring in more active travel. One of the points I want to highlight here is that I think more evidence about the health impacts and the cost benefits isn't enough. So I think that we have to somehow learn to understand better these underlying narratives and how we can influence those, possibly through data and evidence, but that just by presenting the evidence, we won't win that argument, I don't think. So I just picked up on low traffic neighborhoods because Rachel Aldred, an academic at Westminster in London, has done a lot of research on low traffic neighborhoods and health impacts, demonstrating that they do many good things. They save lives. They're really good for Londoners. However, these truths that she has found through her studies have been really debated and continue to be debated. Things like, oh, they'll stop emergency vehicles and other things. So I really welcome a discussion about this, some of the topics that I've introduced here in the end of this talk. And that's because we have a new project called Change Stories that's really focused on how narratives have driven decision-making in cities. And we're doing 3 case study cities around the world that were successful at sustainable, equitable development. They had specific projects that were multi-sectoral, and they somehow managed to bring forward the needs of marginalized groups in a way that was unexpected. So we want to shift the paradigm of how we tell stories about successful urban change and who tells those stories. And we hope that this will lead to other cities around the world to develop deeply contextual solutions to support health, equity, and well-being. So that's our lofty aim for the project. And we are working in 3 cities. We have co-investigators working with community-based organizations doing participatory research in Belfast, Belo Horizonte, and Bogota. And then myself and another colleague in Toronto are looking at the comparative work across and the transferable learnings as well. And we are really interested in how they manage to, using that kind of political term, flip the narrative in those cities where different groups' needs had been historically prioritized, and they managed to bring forward a different narrative that led to change. So in closing, I will just signpost you to the healthyurbanism.net website, where you can find more resources about the Thrives framework. I hope it might be interesting for you in terms of a conceptual underpinning to research studies. I think it can inform health impact assessment. It's also a tool for engagement with different groups. And the case studies are also available on that website. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.